Greetings from Nations University. My name is Dr. David Strigley, and I am the Chief Academic Officer here at Nations University. And I'd like to welcome you to your studies here. If you're watching this video, it is probably a part of your orientation course here at Nations U. We've offered this video because we understand the challenges of working in an international setting. Nations U has students from hundreds of countries around the world, thousands of students who have come to us for studies in biblical studies and religion, theology, and divinity. In those studies, we find that students who come from different backgrounds struggle in different ways. And one of the ways that we discovered is a challenge is the way that people think and write and the way they communicate with one another in their native culture, be that native culture Tennessee or Texas or Nairobi, Kenya. The cultures communicate differently. And so as we have watched those struggles and tried to figure out how to address them, we've developed this video to explain the difference between oral cultures and analytical cultures. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. Analytical cultures tend to be more linear in thinking, more Aristotelian in their logic. And oral cultures tend to be more narrative. In fact, oral cultures tend to depend primarily on storytelling and narratives for conveying their history and conveying many concepts, religion, all kinds of aspects of culture. And so they really value the narrative, and the facts of the narrative are intimately tied to the narrative. In other words, the story conveys as much meaning as the facts do. So in this kind of culture, the narrative inherently provides the why to the facts. So if we want to know why certain things happen, not only do we tell people that they did happen, but the narrative gives the context of that. In more analytical cultures, we tend to rely more heavily on organization of the facts. We want them nice and tidy in a nice linear format using some kind of logical or scientific approach that allows us to convey these thoughts in what we consider in the Western culture a much more logical sequence. But I think as we get through this video, you'll find that maybe we're missing out on in the Western culture some of the deeper aspects of communication. In fact, if there's anything that we have discovered in our Western culture is that we're not great at interpersonal communication, and maybe that's because we have removed ourselves so far from the oral and narrative culture. But in the analytical culture, whereas in the narrative culture, the narrative gives us a lot of the information as background material and that kind of information. In a more analytical culture, it's the individual facts that we rely on. And they're not really tied to the narrative. We're really good at dissecting an article or a story into little components and pieces and analyzing those pieces to death. And when we do that, it becomes the narrator or the writer's job then to explain the why. It's not left to our own, to the reader's ability. It's not left to the reader's assumptions. The writer is going to break apart a story, and it is going to tell the reader, these are the facts that are derived from these stories, and this is what I want you to know about them. And that's quite a bit different than a narrative culture in which everything is just put out there story by story by story. So let's take a minute and talk about providing proof in an oral culture. If I am talking to someone from a much more narrative or oral culture than perhaps here in the U.S., and I ask them to explain something to me, it doesn't matter what it is, I will probably be told a story. Well, here's a story about a dog. And I went to the pound or to the city somewhere, and I bought a dog, and I was walking home one day with this dog after I bought it, and the dog was jumping in my lap and bouncing around, and we just had a great time, and it was a great experience. Well, that story was to convey to me that why dogs perhaps are better pets than cats, but it's a story. And so I said, well, tell me a little bit more. why do you think dogs are better pets than cats? Well, they're going to tell me another story. Now, there's a story about the time we went to the river and we were playing in the river and my dog just jumped right in and fetched the ball and ran back up and shook water all over me. And, cats would never do that. Cats wouldn't even fetch a ball, much less would they bring it back to me. They wouldn't even go in the water. So dogs are definitely better. And we're like, oh, okay, well, give me more proof. And so I get another story. And this will continue on and on and on, because in an oral culture, really the number of stories that I can tell equal the amount of proof I have that my premise is true. And that can be a real challenge in our analytical culture, because in Western world, a bunch of stories is called anecdotal evidence. Anecdotes are just stories, right? That's what an anecdote is. It's a story about something. It's a story with a point about something. And in the analytical scientific world, those anecdotes are considered very, very unreliable, and they're considered to be very poor, very weak arguments from the facts or to support your facts. And so when, as academicians in a Western culture, we start thinking about the proof you have. When we say, I want you to write an essay and I want you to defend your view of some theological aspect, the resurrection, the birth of Christ, I want you to defend those. We are looking for a series of facts. And if you come from an oral culture, you're going to tend to lean toward giving a series of stories. They may be biblical stories. You may tell me the story of Jesus' birth. You may tell me stories from Paul's letters where, Paul said this, and here's a series of information from Paul's letter. But we get whole stories. And then we talk about perhaps how that narrative has, that Bible story, that Bible fact has influenced your own life. But there's story after story after story. And they require the reader, or in this case, the professor, to make assumptions about what is in the story, and making assumptions and trying to derive your thoughts from the stories are much more difficult for us in a Western culture, in an analytical culture, than they are for people who have grown up in and are very familiar with the oral and narrative type culture. So that anecdotal series of story after story after story, to us is very unreliable in a Western culture and in an academic setting. Even though all the facts are there, we struggle with them, and they don't sound quite as scientific the way that we want them to. So what do we want when we're in an analytical culture? Well, we want the same stories. We want to know the facts. We want to know from this story, what are the facts? So instead of narrative 1 and narrative 2 and narrative 3 and 4 and 5, we want you to extract the relevant points from each one of those stories and put them together. So if you are explaining to me why dogs are better pets than cats, you're going to say, well, in this first story, there was a part where the dog jumped in the water and came out and shook water all over me, and we laughed and had a great time. And in this second story, there is a time when this dog played catch with me when I was sitting outside and I was upset, and the dog just came up and licked my face and ran and played catch with me, and I felt much better after that. And then in this other story, there was a time when the dog came up and laid its head on my lap because I was feeling bad, and it just seemed to really empathize with me. And so those are 3 different facts, one from each narrative, one from each different story. So you don't tell the whole story each time. You have to distill, you have to extract from each story the relevant point and put them back together. You do that over and over again. The problem is that when you start dissecting stories and you start breaking them down into component parts, the story goes away. Suddenly there's no story about how I went and bought a dog at the pound and how I was walking home and how much the dog enjoyed being free again and how much we enjoyed going by the park and playing. I mean, the story is gone. Now it's just, I went and bought a dog and the dog liked me. Well, that's a fact. And that's the fact in an analytical culture that we want to hear. But in an oral culture, the whole story is much more important. And so there seems to be a real disservice in an oral culture to the story when you start breaking it down into pieces. But that's the way an analytical culture, and that's the way an academic environment operates. It is individual parts of stories that have been reconstructed into related points about a particular point in your essay. So if you're writing an essay, and if you've done an outline before, depending on what kind you've done, there is point A, or Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, Roman numeral 3, Roman numeral 4, Roman numeral 5. When we do those things, what we're looking for is underneath Roman numeral 1, here is a point from story 1, a point from story 2, a point from story 3, and so on and so on. They're all reconstructed under Roman numeral 1. Then you move down to Roman numeral 2, and you do the same thing again. Okay, under my second point, here is a piece of this story, and here's a piece from another story, and here's a piece from another story. See, that's very different. In an oral culture, Roman numeral 1 is story number 1. Roman numeral 2 is story number 2. But that doesn't work in academic writing. You have to dissect. You have to look at the key points of the story and reconstruct them in one main point. So each Roman numeral, whether it's Roman numeral 1, letter A, and here are the points for that, it's reconstructing. And that's the hardest thing to do when going from an oral culture to a more linear analytical culture, is recognizing the need to reconstruct the stories, the facts from the stories without the stories themselves. Along those same lines, when we are asking you to write that way, we realize that that is not the way that people talk. Not even in America, not even in regular Western culture do we really think that way, where we organize our thoughts in linear format and we analyze and critique them and then repeat them. We don't do that. That's not the way we talk. But when you're writing, and especially in an academic setting, that is what is expected. If you're a preacher, it's even worse, because no one even preaches the way they talk. And now we don't want you to write the way you talk or the way you preach. That's a challenge, especially in our university and in the context of religious training. So many people want to write like they preach, and you don't, though it can get close sometimes, but that's a whole nother video. So you get into this idea that however you preach, however you talk, that's not how you write. You have to get away from that. And then the worst part is that how you write as a student and how you write as an academician is probably nothing like you were taught in any of your previous education. Whether it was in high school or junior high or primary or secondary school, whatever you call it, you were probably taught to write the most generic, simplest way. And you're going to find very quickly that in college, that is not very beneficial. It does not prepare you effectively for college writing. So you're going to have a lot of interaction with your professors where they're going to send papers back to you and say, hey, work on rewriting this, work on explaining this better, because you told me a story, but you didn't explain the facts. You didn't pull the facts together. You didn't synthesize, that's our fancy word. You didn't synthesize the facts of the different stories and the facts of the different writers and the different articles. Bring that together and explain those facts better and why those facts support your argument, the points of your essay. And then do so in a way that is very effective, very logical, and yet creative, so that you can engage the reader. I say that all because when we realize that academic writing is both an art and a science, you have to be able to write logically and with good flow and all of those things, but do so in a way that is still engaging. And that's a real challenge. We don't expect that out of everybody right away, though we do hope that over the course of time in your studies, you will get better and better at being both creative and scientific at the same time. But the goal of academic writing is always the same. It is clarity and persuasion. This is what I believe is true, and this is why I believe you should believe the same way. I'm writing an essay to convince you that my view of the Gospel of John, based on these studies, is the best view and the best way to start, the best model for the hermeneutical approach to the Gospel of John. So that's what it's doing. And lastly, by doing that, it helps train you to be a better theologian, a better apologist, to be able to explain to people why you believe what you believe, a better evangelist, to be able to explain the gospel in both creative and persuasive ways, but also scientific and clear ways, so that people can really say, oh, I understand now why you believe what you believe. That's what we want to happen. Good theologians, good evangelists, good teachers. And if we can accomplish that, we feel like we've really done a great job. So that's what I want to encourage you in this video is if you come from a different culture and you're struggling with writing essays, know that the main difference is if you come from this background where you tell stories and you give lots of information through storytelling, that in academic writing, you're going to have to learn to break it down, put the facts together, and then convey those in a way that is informative and persuasive to the reader, which is going to be the professor most of the time who's grading. You can do that. I trust you can, and good luck, and God bless.